The growls were closer now, the shadows of the lions moving just beyond the firelight, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Zola's hands shook as she grabbed another branch and thrust it into the flames, trying to keep the fire alive, trying to keep the predators at bay. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, even though her entire body trembled with fear. "I'm not going to leave you," she repeated louder this time, her voice filled with determination. "I'm not going to let them hurt you." Mandla stirred, his enormous limbs shifting as he babbled incoherently, his voice still thick with the misery that had plagued him since the day she found him. Zola swallowed hard, blinking away the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't care how big you get, or how loud you cry, or how impossible you are to care for. I'm not going anywhere." The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the ground, but Zola kept her eyes fixed on the dark shape circling them. The lions prowled closer, their low growls vibrating in her chest, but she didn't back down. She wouldn't run. She had spent her entire life being abandoned, but this time she would stay. With trembling hands, she reached for a larger branch, feeding it to the fire, watching as the flames leapt higher, keeping the lions at bay. Her heart pounded, her mind racing, but her resolve was unshakable. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire and the distant growls of the jungle. "I don't know why, but I do. Maybe it's because you need me, the way no one else ever has. Or maybe it's because I need you. But I won't leave you, Mandla. I won't ever leave you." The lions prowled at the edge of the clearing, but they didn't come any closer. Zola held her ground, her breath shaky but steady, her heart full of fear but also full of something else, something stronger than fear. Love. She didn't know when it had started or how it had grown so fast, but it was there, burning in her chest as brightly as the fire she had lit to keep them alive. A low guttural growl echoed through the trees, turning her blood to ice. That sound was unmistakable, danger personified. Lions. They were coming. Her eyes darted wildly, and there, at the edge of the dying firelight, she saw them, sleek golden shapes creeping closer, their eyes gleaming like molten gold. 5 of them, each towering, their muscles rippling beneath their fur as they closed in. Zola's heart hammered, fear tightening in her chest. The lions had been circling for hours, waiting for the moment the fire would falter. Now, with the flames dwindling, they were ready to strike. The low growls rumbled through the ground, vibrating in her bones. Their eyes locked onto her with deadly precision, hungry and unyielding. Zola's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, her heart pounding in her ears as she realized there was no way out, no escape. She glanced behind her at Mandla, who lay helpless, defenseless. "You won't have him," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Get back!" Mandla. The thought of him, the sound of his cries, his impossible sighs, tugged at her heart with a force unlike anything she had ever known. She had promised to stay, to protect him, and that promise anchored her now. No matter how impossible it seemed, she would fight. She would make them work for it, even if death awaited her tonight. The lions were closing in, their glowing eyes searing through the dark, their massive bodies crouched low to the ground, ready to pounce. Zola's hands trembled as she grabbed a stick from the ground, holding it before her like a fragile shield. She knew it was useless, but she would not go down without a fight, not if it meant saving him. And then, just as the lead lion lunged, a brilliant swirling light erupted in the clearing, bathing the entire jungle in radiant warmth. Zola gasped, her eyes widening as the light engulfed her, its warmth palpable as if it wrapped around her in a protective embrace. The lions hesitated, their growls silenced as they skidded to a halt, backing away from the sudden glow in confusion. And then, from the heart of that swirling brilliance, a figure emerged. Zola's breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced with awe and disbelief as the figure grew taller, broader, his silhouette cutting through the mist like a blade. The swirling light coiled around him, illuminating every inch of his powerful form as he stepped forward. It was Mandla, but not the Mandla she had known, the miserable, oversized baby who had cried in her arms. No, this was someone else entirely. Before her eyes he transformed, his massive, childlike body lengthening, his muscles rippling into shape. His dark skin gleamed under the moonlight, his broad shoulders and chiseled chest radiating strength and power. His jet-black dreadlocks cascaded down his back, swaying with every step, and his eyes, no longer filled with misery, glowed with a molten, focused intensity, sharp and alive with purpose. Zola could hardly breathe. This man was incredible. His presence was overwhelming, like a force of nature incarnate. Even the lions sensed it. They backed away, growling low in their throats as Mandla moved forward with a fluid grace that felt almost ethereal. The lions froze, their growls turned to whimpers, their massive forms trembling as though held in place by an invisible force. Zola stood motionless, her heart racing as Mandla's gaze locked onto the lead lion, his expression unreadable. And then, without warning, he moved. He was fast, faster than anything Zola had ever seen. One moment he was beside her, the next he was among the lions, his movements precise and devastating. His fists struck with the fury of a storm, each blow sending shockwaves through the air, his muscles coiled and released in perfect rhythm, a flawless dance of power and control. The lions, once so terrifying, crumbled beneath his strength. Zola's heart raced, her breath shallow and quick as she watched. She had never witnessed anything like it. Mandla's precision, his effortless grace was mesmerizing. Every strike, every movement was deliberate, intentional. The power radiating from him was undeniable, and yet there was a beauty to it, a beauty that left her awestruck. With a final, thunderous blow, the last lion yelped and fled, tail between its legs. The others quickly followed, their growls fading into the distance as they vanished into the night. Zola stood frozen, her hands still clutching the stick as though it were her lifeline. She stared at Mandla, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. He had fought off lions, barehanded. He turned toward her, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, his glowing eyes filled with an intensity that sent a thrill through her body. The swirling light around him began to fade, but its warmth lingered, wrapping around them both like a shield. Zola's lips parted, her heart pounding painfully as she stared at him, the man who had just saved her life. Mandla stepped closer, his voice low, smooth as silk. "It's me, Zola," he said softly. "Mandla." She glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching as her eyes fell on the ground behind her. The enormous body that had once filled the clearing was gone, leaving only a deep imprint in the earth where he had been. She knew it was him, yet the sight still made her heart race. Mandla," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible against the stillness of the jungle. As he stepped closer, the swirling light casting shadows around him, her entire world seemed to shift beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew unraveled. He was breathtaking. No, more than breathtaking. He was beguiling, captivating in a way that felt almost otherworldly. His skin was a deep, rich brown, smooth and flawless, gleaming in the light. His jet-black dreadlocks cascaded down his shoulders, thick and wild, framing a face that was both strong and gentle, his sharp jawline softened by the curve of his lips. And his eyes, those eyes, dark, molten brown, filled with a warmth and depth that took Zola's breath away. They locked onto hers, and in that moment, everything else seemed to fade. The fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, it all melted away as she stared into those eyes. She had never felt so seen, so safe. "Zola!" The man, Mandla, smiled, and it was the most striking smile Zola had ever seen. It was soft, warm, and full of something she couldn't quite name. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and the intensity in his gaze softened, replaced by something gentler, something deeper. "Mandla, it's really you," she said in awe. "Yes," he said, his voice like velvet. "It's me, the curse. It's broken." Zola stared at him, her heart racing, her mind spinning. This man, this impossibly beautiful, powerful man, had been the miserable giant baby she had cared for. The baby who had been too large to move, too loud to comfort, too miserable to soothe. And now, here he stood before her, tall and strong, towering over her like some kind of warrior prince from a forgotten legend. She took a step back, her hands shaking as she tried to process what was happening. How is this possible? Mandla's smile faltered, his gaze growing more serious. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and Zola felt her breath catch as he reached out, gently taking her trembling hand in his. His touch was warm, solid, grounding her in the moment. "I was cursed," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "I am the elder prince, the firstborn son of the king in my village. But I was miserable, spoiled. I didn't understand how to lead, how to care for anyone but myself. I took everything for granted. My father's love, the people's respect, even my own life." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground as he spoke, the weight of his past hanging heavy in the air. "The witch doctor who served our family saw this in me. She saw how ungrateful, how selfish I had become, so she cast a spell that turned me into the very thing I had acted like. A baby, miserable, helpless, and completely dependent on others." Zola's heart ached as she listened to him, the pain in his voice so raw, so real. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like for him, trapped in that form, knowing that his own arrogance and selfishness had led to his downfall. "But the spell wasn't just to punish me," Mandla continued, his voice softening as he lifted his gaze to meet hers again. "It was to teach me, to make me understand what it means to be truly vulnerable, to need someone else in a way I had never allowed myself to need anyone before. And the only way to break the spell was to find someone who could love me, despite everything, someone who would love me unconditionally." Zola swallowed hard, her chest tightening as she realized what he was saying. "Me," she whispered. Mandla nodded, his fingers tightening around hers. "You," he said softly. "You broke the curse, Zola. You, with your kindness, your strength, your love. I never thought anyone could love me like that, but you did." Zola's heart raced, her mind reeling. She had loved him, hadn't she? Even when he had been impossible, even when he had been miserable and too big to move, she had cared for him, protected him, loved him. Mandla's grip on her hand tightened, and he stepped closer, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And now I can return to my village. I can take my place as the king's son again, and I can take you with me." Zola's breath caught in her throat as she stared up at him. His presence was overwhelming, his height dwarfing her small frame. His powerful chest rose and fell with each steady breath, and she felt as though she could melt into the warmth of him, the safety he exuded. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own racing heartbeat. Mandla smiled again, that soft, beguiling smile that made her stomach flip. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "All you have to do is come with me, be by my side. I've learned my lesson, Zola. I know what it means to love, and I found it with you. I can't imagine returning to my village without you." His words washed over her like a warm wave, filling the cracks in her heart that had been left by years of loneliness and abandonment. For so long, she had believed she was meant to be alone. That love, that family, that connection were things she wasn't meant to have. But now, standing before this man, this prince, she realized she had found something more, something real, something she had never dared to hope for. Mandla cupped her cheek with his hand, his touch gentle, reverent. "Zola," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. "Come with me. Be my queen. Let me take care of you the way you took care of me." Zola's heart swelled in her chest as she looked up at him, her body trembling with the weight of everything she had just learned, everything she had just felt. She didn't know how it had happened, how she had gone from a girl who lived in the shadows of a village that had never accepted her, to standing here, in the arms of a man who saw her, who wanted her, who loved her. And as she gazed into his deep brown eyes, Zola felt something inside her shift. She had found love, true, unconditional love, and she had no intention of letting it go. "I'll come with you," she whispered, her voice steady, her heart full. Mandla's smile widened, his eyes glowing with warmth and joy. He pulled her close, wrapping his strong arms around her as if he would never let her go. And for the first time in her life, Zola felt truly, deeply, undeniably safe. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the jungle. The air was cool and still, carrying with it the quiet promise of a new day. Zola stood beside Mandla, or rather, Prince Mandla, her heart thumping in her chest as they prepared to return to the village. Everything felt surreal. Just hours ago, she had been a frightened outcast, hiding in the shadows of the jungle with a cursed baby, and now she was walking beside the most handsome man she had ever seen, a prince who had chosen her. Zola glanced up at him, her breath catching as the early morning light highlighted the sharp angles of his face, his strong jawline, the smoothness of his skin. His jet-black dreadlocks framed his face, falling over his broad shoulders in thick, luxurious waves. He moved with the grace of someone who had been born into royalty, every step purposeful, powerful. But what captivated her most was the way he looked at her. His deep brown eyes, so warm and rich, were always on her, filled with an emotion she hadn't quite gotten used to yet. Admiration, respect, love. The intensity in his gaze made her stomach flutter, and every time he smiled, that soft, beguiling smile that reached his eyes, she felt like her heart might burst. It was a strange thing to feel so safe, so wanted, after spending so much of her life on the outside looking in. But with Mandla, all those old fears seemed to melt away. He had seen her, truly seen her, and instead of pushing her away, he had drawn her in. As they walked back toward the village, Zola's mind raced with thoughts of what awaited them. The villagers who had exiled her, the people who had turned their backs on her. What would they say now, seeing her return with a prince by her side? She couldn't help but feel a small flicker of pride, knowing that they would see her differently. No longer the outcast, no longer the girl they whispered about behind closed doors. When they reached the outskirts of the village, the change in the atmosphere was immediate. Word had spread quickly. Villagers were already gathering, their faces filled with confusion, awe, and disbelief as they watched Zola and Mandla approach. Whispers rippled through the crowd, growing louder with each passing second. "Is that Zola? Who is that man? He looks like royalty." The elders were the first to step forward, their stern faces etched with skepticism and wariness. Elder Makize, the woman who had led Zola's exile, narrowed her eyes as she looked between Zola and the towering prince at her side. "Zola," she began, her voice tight, "what is the meaning of this?" Before Zola could respond, Mandla stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone around them. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his expression calm but powerful. "I am Prince Tabiso," he said, his voice strong and unwavering, "elder son of the king of the southern lands. You may call me Mandla, as given to me by my love. I was cursed by a witch doctor long ago, turned into the form of a baby, doomed to remain that way until someone could love me for who I truly am." "Zola," he paused, his gaze softening as he looked down at her. She broke the curse. Through her love, her care, and her unwavering heart, I have been restored. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the disbelief palpable. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, their eyes wide with shock. Elder Makize opened her mouth as if to protest, but Mandla's gaze silenced her before she could utter a word. He continued, his voice firm. "You cast Zola out of this village. You treated her as an outcast, but she is no such thing. She is strong, compassionate, and more worthy than any of you gave her credit for. And now she will be my queen." Zola felt her heart skip a beat at his words. Queen. It still felt too unreal to grasp, but as she looked up at Mandla's proud, confident face, she knew it was true. This was her place now, beside him. Mandla turned toward her, and as he did, something incredible happened. He reached into the folds of his cloak, pulling out the most exquisite garment Zola had ever seen. It shimmered in the early morning light, made of the finest silk, woven with gold threads that seemed to glow. The gown was delicate but regal, fit for a queen. With gentle hands, Mandla draped the gown over her shoulders, his fingers brushing against her skin, sending a warm shiver down her spine. His smile was soft as he looked at her, his brown eyes filled with admiration. "You saved me, Zola," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "Now let me show the world who you truly are." Zola's breath hitched in her throat as she felt the silk settle around her body, the smooth fabric caressing her skin like a second layer of protection. She had never worn anything like this, never felt so seen. The villagers around them stared, their disbelief turning to awe as they took in the sight of her, no longer the outcast but a queen standing beside her prince. Mandla offered her his arm and she took it, her heart racing as they began to walk together through the village. The crowd parted before them, the once skeptical and fearful villagers now standing in stunned silence. Zola could feel their eyes on her, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the sting of their judgment. Instead, she felt powerful. She had faced the impossible, had cared for a cursed, miserable baby that no one else would have even looked at. And through it all, she had found something far greater than she had ever imagined. Love. As they walked through the village, Mandla leaned down slightly, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "I will never leave your side, Zola. You are my heart, my queen, and together we will rule with the love and strength you showed me." Zola's heart swelled with emotion, and she turned to look up at him, her smile matching his. She had found something she had never believed possible, someone who loved her truly and deeply for who she was. And with Mandla, she knew her life would never again be lonely or predictable. They walked side by side, the prince and his queen, toward the future they would build together. And as they left the village behind, Zola knew that her life, once filled with solitude and uncertainty, was now brimming with love, adventure, and the promise of something extraordinary.